I wish you could have known Ed Rothar. Ed was a unique gentleman. He stands very firmly in my mind because he taught a lot of the classes in radio and television when I was working on a degree in broadcasting down in Southern California. And he taught a terrific class on the history of radio and television. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Loeffler here with you. Ed Rothar passed away in 2011, and I was sorry to see it because he was an integral part of my life for a long time. An interesting gentleman who just throve, if that's the word, on the history of radio and television. He could just paint this for you. He had us listening to all the old transcripts and the shows, and we knew who did what and what David Sarnoff was like. Who was the radio operator in New York that received the distress call from the Titanic? It was David Sarnoff, NBC. Anyway, so that's number one. I wish you could have known Ed Rothar because you would have really appreciated this. He did a series called I Remember Radio. You can search that, Google it. And number two, have you ever wondered why we have stations with a K and a W in this country? Ever think about that? Well, here's the answer for you. W is for radio and television stations east of the Mississippi, and K is for stations west of the Mississippi. We needed two leading call indicators. In Canada, the stations start with a C. In Mexico, X or XE. This is by international treaty. And that was simply the dividing line. But you will say to me, but wait, John, there are some stations east of the Mississippi. They must have snuck over there when no one was looking because they start with a K, like KDKA Pittsburgh. Yes, you're right. KDKA and a number of other stations were grandfathered in when this dividing line was set up. And to this day, they retain their original call signs. And KDKA was the first radio station in the country to broadcast the returns of the Harding-Cox presidential elections. That was a first in the history of broadcasting in this country. So I'm leading you down a trail. The Federal Communications Commission made an astounding move at the end of September, and very few people hardly even noticed it. Remember, I made all this row a couple of weeks ago about turnover of the domain control of the Internet. This will probably prove to be equally as bad. On September 29th, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, has voted unanimously to put America's entire broadcast industry on fast track for a foreign takeover by Chinese, Russian, or Muslim Brotherhood front corporations who then could control the hiring and firing of whoever works for them. It used to be, by the way, that networks could only have a limited number of stations that they owned. They were called O&Os, owned and operated stations, and there was a maximum of 7 that they could actually own and operate to prevent any kind of a monopoly. The same thing was also true of the number of outlets any one licensee could own in a particular market, and that was to prevent people from having one particular viewpoint splattered across a whole series of stations, and people in a community would get no alternative viewpoints. It was really the best of freedom of speech. It was trying to manage what were a limited number of available frequencies at the time. Well, that began to slide as more and more big groups of radio station owners would gobble up X number of frequencies in a market. But turning over the licensee idea to, say, owners who are not U.S. nationals is a disaster waiting to happen. Jerry Kenny's with me here today. He's president of Kenny Broadcasting Corporation. I noticed you were just telling me before we got on the air here, you had filed a complaint with the Department of Justice alleging that foreign channels Russia Today and Al Jazeera are violating U.S. law by not disclosing that they're agents of foreign powers in their broadcasts. Explain that one, then we'll move into the latest.
Okay, that actually sprang from a situation here where one day I turned on the local cable channel, our local public television station, and saw Al Jazeera and Russia Today airing. And so I hired an attorney, a communications attorney, and I filed a complaint with the FCC simply because the contract that they were using said that the local PBS station would not be allowed to preempt any of the programming, which, as you know, that's an unauthorized transfer of control of a station. In looking into it, I also found that they were required, since this programming, by the way, Russia Today is a production, pretty much everyone will agree, of the FSB, which used to be the KGB. Even though it's considered an American company, it's actually controlled by Vladimir Putin's group.
I call it the KG used to be.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, they still are. Maybe the KG part is.
Yeah. No, they've just changed names. That's all they did.
That's all they did.
Yeah, they're off
and
and
of
running.
course, Al Jazeera is totally funded by the dictatorship of Qatar, essentially the Muslim Brotherhood. So anyway, I had contacted the Department of Justice and pointed out to them that there's a thing called the Foreign Agents Registration Act in this country where we don't prohibit people from speaking because of our First Amendment, but I call it caller ID for propagandists, that at least they have to identify who they are and who is in control of the organization. So I sent a complaint to the Department of Justice, and I got a nice letter back along with a copy of the law saying that if they feel there's any problem, they'll look into it.
Which means absolutely nothing.
Yeah, which means they ignored it just like the Obama administration ignores any law that they don't agree with. And also with the FCC, actually on that one, the complaint regarding the unauthorized transfer of control of the local public television station, they actually amended their contract to allow the local station to preempt Russia Today or Al Jazeera. But the funny thing about it was when I originally contacted the station, they didn't even know they were carrying the programming.
How did they get the program?
Yeah, they got the programming from a company it was a network feed that was there was a company, Commonwealth Broadcasting, which is still around, and they had a little division called Megahertz Network. What had happened was during the digital transition, these television stations suddenly found themselves with more channels than they had programming for. They could barely program the channels that they had, but now you could have upwards of 5, 6, 7, 12 channels in the bandwidth that you used to be able to put one channel through. So along came these guys out of Washington that said, hey, we've got all kinds of programming for the globally minded viewer, and they took flat-out propaganda channels and put them on public television where our tax dollars were paying to distribute Vladimir Putin's Russia Today.
Okay, let's zoom out to the bigger picture now, because so people understand. First of all, you mentioned the licensee. The licensee is ultimately the party who has control over what goes on the air by law, who is also responsible if the wrong thing gets on the air. So say, for example, network is carrying a show and they use some bad, nasty little words. Remember, we had a pretty good speech code years ago on what could and couldn't be said on the air. If the network ran it and the station carried it, it was still the station's responsibility, the licensee. Now the FCC wants to take the ownership and allow it to be held by foreign licensors. Now, why this one? What's going on? This one is even of deeper concern to me.
This is very, very bad. Well, as you know, it has been possible in the past for foreign corporations to own American broadcast entities. They could easily do it up to a 25% ownership. Anything over that, they would actually have to go to the FCC in a special procedure and prove to the FCC that their ownership of the broadcast station would be conducted in the public's interest. They had to make a positive case for that. And that's what the law says even today. But what the FCC has come up with now is a rule that essentially guts the law, and it says that the staff will go ahead and automatically approve any foreign owner that wants to buy a radio or TV business. And if anyone has a problem with it, they have to prove that it will be not in the best interest of the public. So the burden of proof now is on the public to prove that it would not be in their best interest. And it was interesting because at the proceeding that the FCC had, it was just a quick thing that was done, although they did have to go through about a year-long process to collect public input on it. And by the way, the people that were pushing this was called the Coalition for Broadcast Investment. And it was all the usual suspects like Walt Disney Corporation, CBS, Sinclair Broadcasting, all of the owners of broadcast properties right now that would kind of really like to get out of the business. So they're looking for foreign money. But that's essentially what has happened. But during the procedure, Jessica Rosenwasser, one of the commissioners, made the statement. She said, sometimes the law gets in the way of investment. So she admitted that the law got in the way of, so they were going to pass a new rule. And rather than respect the law that Congress passed, they just went ahead and did a rule that gutted it. But this is a very big problem because we know the national media is pretty much corrupt at this point. People still do watch local television. They still do listen to local radio. This will afford the opportunity for foreign corporations to come in, and many of them will be front organizations for governments. Like I said, Russia Today is considered to be an American company, and they will operate these local stations. And the thing that really concerns me about this, we know how our elected officials, how sensitive they are to bad press. And so if you have a full-power television station let's say, for example, here in Orlando, that reaches 2 million people, and that station happens to be owned by an investor from Russia. Do you think that congressman, your local congressman, is really going to want them giving him bad press here locally?
No, you can see this, that since the 1980s, one of the ways of end running all of this mainline bottleneck of information, ideologically especially, has been through talk radio, and then about a decade later, the internet and talk radio on the internet, in addition to internet newspapers, have end run that. Well, the politicos worldwide, it's not just here, Jerry, it's in Europe as well. They're all upset by this because all of their problems, quote unquote, are being caused by people pointing out all the deficiencies in their great ideas or all the shenanigans, and they want to shut it down. And you can just see if somebody comes in as a licensee, what does he do? Well, he trash cans any talk show host who doesn't talk about what he wants them to talk about.
Well, and they can do this. I think the organizations that are going to be the most vulnerable to this foreign takeover, for example, if you take iHeartRadio, they're the largest radio station ownership group in the United States, and financially things have not been great in the radio business, and they also, if I'm not mistaken, somehow syndicate Rush Limbaugh. And if somebody were to come in and just say, hey, let me relieve you of these problems, and we'll go ahead and write you a big fat check for a few $1 billion. And oh, by the way, Mr. Limbaugh, you can either tone it down or there's the door. Reuters did a very extensive story on this last year. In fact, they interviewed me for some of it. They were looking into the fact that the Chinese had been going around the United States working out, because they couldn't buy the stations at that time. They were doing local marketing agreements with stations in Washington, D.C., Houston. There were a bunch of them. They had a front man going around the country buying these stations up. They weren't running commercials. They were basically just telling the worldview from the communist Chinese point of view. You know, is that really what we want? Do we want to turn our airwaves over? I think, was it Abraham Lincoln said that he that controls public opinion is more powerful than a judge?
What happens is the media sets the tone, and then that ultimately becomes law and or policy based on how the people react. And what you're seeing in this split we're seeing in the elections today here, Jerry, is the fact that what's happened in the cable channels is everybody's listening to the channels that massage their ears with things they want to hear, and they don't really hear the other side of the story. And so we talk about a divided nation. That's why you could hash most of these ideas out pretty fast.
And I think a lot of people think that broadcast is yesterday's technology. It's not really needed any longer. We have the internet. I would just like to remind everybody, what is it, last week, that a big part of the internet was shut down in the Northeast. And a lot of the times when you see real bad problems break out in some of these countries overseas, what's the first thing to go? The internet. They shut that down. So, I mean, I've done an internet television program with some folks out of Washington. I do Roku channels. I've developed Roku channels for people before, and I love the technology, but they are not broadcast stations. I think that what has happened with the FCC is absolutely unconscionable. We've written about it. I've been writing about this for over a year. I think people nowadays are just so divided in their attention. They have so many things to distract them. You know, you've got 500 cable channels, a gazillion websites. People have handheld devices that they can barely walk down the street without bumping into somebody. They're addicted to these things, and they're just not paying attention to the fact that this globalization that they're trying to force on us here in the United States is really being force-fed to us by allowing foreign front corporations to buy our broadcast properties. And, you know, one of the things that the FCC said, well, we're not going to allow these radio and television stations to fall into the hands of bad players, and we're going to vet whoever it is that purchases the radio and TV stations. And I'm thinking, you mean the same people that vetted the Iran nuclear deal?
You and I both know that's all political garbage. You can read through this real quickly. These are sop words that sound really good, but then as soon as you scrutinize it, you know it's not going to hold up.
And I love how they say, well, our security people will look into it. Well, great. So they're supposed to look into the terror cells that are here in the United States. We're seeing how that's working out. I'm sure they do a great job, but they don't get them all. We know that here being in Central Florida. But then somehow they're going to be able to go to these closed societies like Russia and these Middle Eastern monarchies and communist China, and they're going to follow the money trail in those countries back to the governments that would be funding these things. Come on.
You know, Congress can jump in here and say, no, we're not going to allow that. We're going to deep six this whole decision by the FCC. Any move to do that?
I don't think so. And in fact, in the piece that I wrote for Accuracy in Media, I put a link on the page to the fact that not even